My wife and I had been looking forward to the birth of our first child with great excitement. It was a profoundly emotional chapter in our lives, but everything took a sharp turn just a week before the due date when I uncovered her long-standing affair. I was lost on what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't just let it go. The scene in the hospital room seemed like something out of a picture-perfect family moment, almost like a Norman Rockwell painting, though definitely not one fit for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. On one side of the bed sat my mother-in-law, and on the other, my own mother. Both of them exchanged warm smiles with my wife as she nursed our newborn daughter. Newborns aren't exactly cute in the traditional sense, but parents and grandparents always seem to see them differently. Still, as I looked on, I couldn't deny that our baby didn't look half bad. Her skin had turned from a blotchy red to a soft pink, the waxy vernix she was born with had been cleaned off, and even her head, which had been slightly cone-shaped, was starting to round out nicely. I had a feeling that, over time, she'd grow to look just like her mother, Jess, my wife of 6 years, the woman I once believed was the love of my life. I stood back, watching Jess nurse while both our mothers gave advice she didn't really need. She seemed to handle it all with ease, thanks to the parenting classes we'd attended together, where we learned all about breastfeeding and newborn care. As I stepped aside, a nurse entered the room, followed by another woman. "This is Ms. Denkin from administration," said the nurse, whose name I couldn't quite remember. "She has the birth certificate request form for you to fill out whenever you're ready." The nurse turned to Jess and continued, "Once you're heiress nursing, Ms. Denkin will need some basic details. Most of the information's already on file, like your date and place of birth, but we'll also need your full names, your husband's name, your maiden name, your ages, and a few other things. After that, we'll send it off to the parish court, and you'll receive a copy in the mail in a few weeks." With that, Ms. Denkin quietly left the room. "Honey, why Eric you take care of this and fill out the form?" Jess suggested, giving me a smile that I didn't return. "I'm a little busy at the moment," she added, motioning to the baby. I shook my head. Eric think I'll let you handle it right now." "We'll wait until later, once you're not tied up with the baby," I replied. "Besides, I think we should wait for the DNA test results to confirm whether I'm the father." If this were a movie, you could almost hear the screech of a record needle being yanked across the vinyl, bringing everything to a halt. For anyone unfamiliar with vinyl records, those round discs where sound is etched into grooves, the analogy might not make sense, but you get the picture. Stunned would be an understatement. 3 of the 4 women in the room stared at me in utter shock, their mouths hanging open. The 4th, being a baby, wasn't looking at me, but she sure made her displeasure known when her meal was suddenly interrupted, letting out a cry that barely rose above the collective gasps from the others. My mother-in-law was the first to break the silence. "Are you out of your mind? Why would you even think to suggest such a thing?" she demanded, turning to look at Jess. Jess's face morphed from disbelief to suspicion, and finally to pure rage. "How dare you accuse me of having another man's child?" she hissed, her voice filled with fury. "What kind of woman do you think I am?" she added, her voice faltering as she forced a strained smile that never quite landed. "Oh, I get it, this must be an April Fool's joke. Well, let me tell you, it's not funny. You should know better." But her tense posture said otherwise. Her shock was written all over her face, even though her words tried to say otherwise. I wasn't buying it for a second. "I'm dead serious," I said, my tone ice cold. "There's a good chance I'm not the father. How could you even think I'd cheat on you? Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me? Just name one time I made you believe I was with someone else," she demanded, trying to sound indignant. Instead of answering her question, I said, "So, you're sticking with the usual, deny, 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 and you're doing it without so much as flinching. I gotta say, that's impressive." Then I turned toward my mother-in-law and said, "Maybe you should move the car seat from my car to yours, so you can take Jess and the baby home this afternoon. And it might be best if you stay with her for a while." You've both offered to help before, and I always said we could handle it, but I think I might actually need that support now since I won't be around." Just as I was about to leave, my mom's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "You stay right there, Jason Luis Fontano," she commanded. Reluctantly, I turned around, already bracing myself for what was coming. My mom and mother-in-law exchanged looks, then glanced over at Jess, who had started crying uncontrollably. "No. You can't leave me and Connie. She's our baby." "You're her father," Jess sobbed before I had the chance to respond to my mom. "I know I planned on being the dad," I replied calmly, "but am I really the father? There's a difference." My mom stepped in front of me and tapped my chest firmly to get my attention. She grabbed the front of my shirt, pulling me close like she used to when I was a kid. "What's gotten into you, Jason? Why are you acting so stupid all of a sudden? You can't start doubting now. It's too late for that. You've been over the moon since Sue told you she was pregnant. You've been reading all the baby books, you bought and put together the crib, the changing table, and everything else in that nursery. You even painted the walls pink and yellow with those little animals. Every week, you bring something new for that baby, half the toys she won't even use until she can walk." She stopped and stared me down. "So, what's this change of heart about?" "I've had a bit of an epiphany," I confessed. "I'm not so excited anymore, and I'm sure you've noticed." It was my mother-in-law, Carolyn, who answered. "We all noticed. You never hugged Connie, never even really looked at her. We thought maybe the reality of being a parent was just hitting you hard. If that baby's mine, I'll do everything I can to be the best dad possible," I said, this time with enough certainty to make both my mom and Carolyn step back. "But that changed last week when I found out I might not be the father." "What?" The word shot out from 3 different voices at once. "I'll take care of the baby if she's mine," I said, raising my voice. "But if she's not, then Cabe Adams can take care of his own child." As soon as I said his name, Jess shouted, "Cabe and I never did anything." "We never, how can you even say that?" I walked to the foot of the bed while my mom and Carolyn exchanged uneasy glances between me and Jess. "You're still going to pretend you didn't have an affair for nearly 6 months and only ended it 7 months ago when you found out you were pregnant? And if I'm not mistaken, he told you to make sure I never found out he could be involved, didn't he?" "No. No, and anyone saying otherwise is lying." Jess screamed. "Who is Cabe Adams? And who told you about this so-called affair?" Carolyn demanded. "I want to know who's been spreading lies about my daughter." I ignored his first question and calmly responded to the second. "Cabe Adams himself," I said quietly. Before Jess could fully absorb what I had said, maybe because she was so exhausted and distressed, she blurted out, "He would never tell you that. He promised." Carolyn's eyes flicked between Jess and me, his expression shifting. "I need to hear exactly what you know," he said firmly. I paused for a moment before addressing Jess directly. "Cabe spilled everything, Jess. He told me everything about the two of you. But to be fair, he was under a bit of pressure at the time, so he let it all out," I admitted. "Lies!" Jess cried, her voice trembling. "Cabe was perfectly fine when he called yesterday to check on me and the baby." Her words slipped out before she seemed to realize the mistake she'd made, but the truth was clear to everyone. Carolyn flinched visibly, and I glanced over at my mom, who was wide-eyed and taking in every detail. "So, you're still talking to your old lover?" I asked, my voice thick with sarcasm. "Did he give you any more advice on how to keep me in the dark about whether or not he's the father?" Jess broke down, sobbing so hard that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful. There's no way you could have found out." "No one knew," she exclaimed, her voice almost frantic. "She's in a bit of shock," I said to the first nurse, who shot me a look like she was ready to defend her patient. "I suppose I came across a little strange, talking about paternity like that." She needs to fill out the birth certificate, I continued, watching the nurse's skeptical expression. She wants me to put my name down, but I think we should wait until we're sure whether I'm the father or if it's the guy she was seeing while she got pregnant. I noticed the nurse's face change, her understanding of the situation finally sinking in. She turned her attention back to calming Jess. "Miss Fontano, I need you to take some deep breaths, okay? Just like you did during delivery. We Eric want to give you anything that might affect your milk, so let's try breathing first. Cheryl's ready to bring something to help if you need it, but let's start with the breathing exercises." The nurse guided her through it. While I watched the nurse working with Jess, I hadn't noticed my mom and Carolyn stepping closer. "You need to explain what's really going on," my mom whispered harshly. Her voice startled me. She rarely spoke that way, but today, she'd erase it twice. Clearly, something serious was happening. "This has caught Sue completely off guard," Carolyn remarked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I need to know the full story. What happened? When did this start? And how?" "Well, that should be pretty clear," I said, irritation rising in me as both women stared me down like I was the one in the wrong here, not Jess. "She got involved with a coworker when she found out she was pregnant. At least one guy other than me, whether there were others, I can't say for sure," I added. Jess, surprisingly, pulled herself together quickly, considering how close to a breakdown she had been just moments earlier. "We were so careful," she muttered again, her voice desperate. I could see the same curiosity in both my mom and Carolyn's faces. They were trying to piece it all together. "Yes, you were very discreet," I acknowledged. "I had no idea. No one else did either, from what I can tell." I paused, then added, "But Cabe, well, he was a smooth talker, good at charming his way into his next conquest. Or in this case, his last one. He needed to prove how good he was, I guess. You know Cheryl Watkins, right?" I asked, and Jess nodded. Cheryl had been her coworker for years. "Well, Cabe set his sights on her too. He convinced her to meet him at a hotel. Her biggest concern was that Cabe might talk, and that her husband would find out. She wasn't sure she could trust him to keep quiet," I continued. To prove his discretion, he gave her some details about his past flings, or whatever you want to call them, affairs, relationships, girlfriends. He threw out a few names and provided enough info to convince her he wasn't just bluffing. He even asked if she could think of anyone else he might have been involved with, outside of the public girlfriends. "Married or single women in the office?" Cheryl had asked. Naturally, she couldn't name any off the top of her head. So, to gain her trust, he mentioned a few women from the office that she knew. "The one before you was Sandy, if I recall. She backed off after a few months when she suspected her husband was getting wise. Then came you. It lasted 6 months, but you ended it when you found out you were pregnant. He told Cheryl you hoped I'd be the father, but you didn't want to keep the affair going," I said, pausing to let the words sink in. Jess looked like she'd been punched in the gut, but I kept going. "He made it clear how crucial it was that I, your husband, never found out. He worried that if I knew, things would fall apart between us, and he didn't want to deal with child support. You were open about the pregnancy at work, sharing the news with everyone as soon as you found out. You probably assumed I wouldn't catch on, and even if I did, I'd stick around for the baby and ignore any doubts I had." I sighed. "But that wasn't something I was willing to overlook. Turns out, after you, he moved on to Lana Richard. Her husband got suspicious when she suddenly started working late a lot. She had to be more cautious and even showed up late to pick up her youngest from daycare more than once. Because of the issues in her personal life, Cabe shifted his focus to Cheryl, and, well, he managed to win her over too." I shook my head at the thought. As I said, he's a smooth talker, always knew how to say the right things to get what he wanted. Apparently, he wasn't bad in bed either, keeping his married lovers satisfied enough that they kept coming back for months. Carolyn and my mom exchanged a look before they both turned to Jess. Why would Cheryl confess something like that? My mom asked, disbelief in her voice. It wasn't on purpose, I explained. Seems Cheryl has a tendency to talk during intimate moments. She accidentally blurted out Cabe's name in the heat of things. Her husband, Dan, pushed her about it, and eventually, she came clean. I let out a short laugh, recalling the story Dan had told me over beers. Dan said Cheryl wasn't the type to just make random sounds during sex, not like Jess here. According to him, Cheryl preferred to, let's say, vocalize her desires. So one night, in the middle of things, she shouted, "Give it to me, Cabe." I love it. I couldn't help but smile grimly as I went on. Dan confronted her directly afterward. That's how he described it when he was talking to me and Mike, Lana's husband. Dan admitted he was a little worried that Mike, being a cop, might report him for threatening his wife. Apparently, Dan told her, "You better start talking, or I'll have to make a decision about who I'm gonna hit." I stopped myself before I said too much, then added, "She wisely chose to talk. Dan's a stand-up guy. He told me everything, Jason, because he felt like I deserved to know that there was a chance I wasn't the father of the child my wife was carrying. He hoped I'd do the same for him if I ever found out about his wife stepping out on him." I assured him I'd handle the situation. And I also made it clear that if Cabe didn't step up and take responsibility for his kid, he might lose the freedom to keep playing his little games. Dan mentioned that Cabe might not have much longer to play his games, I continued. He was planning to inform the husband of another woman involved, someone I didn't know as well as Mike or Dan. From what I'd heard, the guy had a nasty temper, and things could easily blow up if he found out too soon. So we all agreed to wait a week before taking any action, just to spare Jess from the extra stress of her affair becoming public right away. Mike was fuming, but he agreed to hold off for that 1 week. Now that the baby was here, though, it was time to let the truth about Cabe and his affairs come to light. I had already given Carolyn and Mom a toned-down version of the story. I appreciated their discretion during the final weeks of Jess's pregnancy. They pulled me aside into the hallway, wanting to have this discussion away from Jess so we wouldn't upset her any more than she already was. Meanwhile, the second nurse had taken baby Connie to the nursery. "So, why do you seem so calm?" Mom asked. "I can tell you're hurting, but not as much as I thought you would be." I explained that I'd had a week to process everything, which seemed to ease her a bit. "All right, you've had time to think," she nodded. "I trust you'll let us know when you're ready." Carolyn jumped in next. "So, when are you planning to collect the samples for the DNA test?" she asked, sounding a little surprised when I told her they'd already been sent off. I had spoken to the head nurse the day before the baby was born. Since Jess and I were married, the law assumed I was the father, meaning I didn't need her permission to test the baby. I opted for the expedited test, and we should have the results in 2 to 3 days. "Do you think you could ever forgive Jess and move on, even if the baby's not yours?" Carolyn asked, cautiously. I noticed she referred to Connie as the baby, avoiding her name, which was unlike her. Carolyn was perceptive, and I could tell she was still holding out hope. I glanced at my mom, and I could see she already knew what I was thinking. She wasn't happy about it, but she understood. "To be honest," I said quietly, "I Eric know if I can move forward with this, even if I am Connie's father." I sighed and continued, "I've had over a week to think about it. This wasn't a one-night slip-up. It was a 6-month affair. I can't trust her anymore. She didn't just disregard me, she knew the risk of getting pregnant by that guy while we were trying to have a baby. I'd told the whole family we were planning to conceive. The fact that she kept things going with Cabe tells me she didn't care who fathered her child." "Have you thought about couples therapy?" Mom asked, maybe anticipating what Jess's family would bring up. "Think of the baby. Connie's not at fault in all this. She's going to need a father, and even if you're not her biological dad, you could still be her dad in every way that counts." I'm not sure therapy's going to help, Mom, I replied. What I really want to know is where I went wrong as a husband. There must have been something I did, or didn't do, that made Jess feel like she needed to betray me. It's not like she was trying to replace me with Cabe. He's a notorious womanizer, and there's no way he would ever commit to her. I'm sure she knew that. I paused, choosing my words carefully. The terms womanizer or scoundrel popped into my head, but I held them back. No one in this mess deserved my anger, but I was so tense I felt like I could explode at any moment. Other than the physical side of things or maybe the thrill of it all, I Eric know what else she saw in him, I added, my frustration leaking through. I thought we had a solid relationship. You can imagine what kind of state I've been in since I found out. Like you said, Mom, I was over the moon at the thought of becoming a father, and then, just like that, everything fell apart. My whole world shattered. Honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father, I admitted, my voice flat. Both my mom and Carolyn looked shocked to hear me say that. If I'm not, I won't have to deal with being a part-time dad. And frankly, I'm not sure I can handle being around Jess, even if the baby is mine. That would mean a whole lot of therapy, and I Eric know if I'm up for that. Just then, the nurse came out of the room and approached me. Mr. Fontano, your wife wants to speak with you, she said gently. She mentioned she knew you were still here, otherwise, her mother would have come back. The nurse's tone was kind, like she was trying to show some sympathy for what I was going through. But she stopped me before I could walk past her and warned, if you go back in, I hope you can stay calm. I understand you're upset, but we Eric want to agitate her too much. We're trying to avoid any medications. She's scheduled for discharge this afternoon, and it wouldn't be ideal to give her anything that might affect the baby through her breast milk. I'm sure you remember from your childbirth classes how important colostrum and those first few days of breastfeeding are for building the baby's immune system. I nodded, realizing she was appealing to my concern for the baby's health, whether or not the child was mine. Maybe you should go talk to her, Mom suggested softly. Carolyn and I can grab some coffee. Give me your car keys, and we'll move the car seat. And while you're heading to the nursery, take a good look at Connie. I think she looks a lot like you did when you were born. Wishful thinking, Mom. Or are you just seeing what you want to see? I asked, half joking. She shrugged, clearly unhappy with the situation. I knew that if I turned out to be Connie's father, Mom would be there to help raise her, no matter what happened between Jess and me. She was already invested in her role as a grandmother, just like I had been ready to step into fatherhood. It was obvious she hadn't fully processed the idea that Connie might not be her granddaughter after all. I stepped into the room, and as soon as Jess saw me, she burst into tears again. You must hate me, she sobbed. No, I replied, my voice strained. I Eric hate you, that's the problem. I hate what you did. I'm so angry that I can barely think straight. Inside, I wanted nothing more than to shake her or just walk out of that room for good, but I held back. There was still a slim chance the baby was mine, and I needed some answers. Do you really want to talk right now, or do you need a few more days to figure out how you're going to explain all this? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I Eric need more time, Jess began, but I cut her off. Really? You've had 9 months to come up with what you'd say if I ever found out you cheated on me, with Cabe Adams of all people. I spat his name out like it left a bad taste in my mouth. Taking a deep breath, I continued, no, I didn't seriously think he could be the father. That was you. I thought we were having our baby. Our baby. Jess tried to defend herself. I might be the father, I said coldly, but I doubt it. I checked my work schedule. Most of the first week of July, the time you supposedly got pregnant, I was offshore on the oil rig. I remember when I got home, we made up for lost time, and yeah, we were intimate, just like we always were, or used to be. What I didn't know was that Cabe was involved around the same time. Jess started to protest, but I cut her off again. It's fine. During the weeks leading up to me getting off that helicopter, you had him here while I was gone. You slept with him in our bed. It's not even about where you did it, it's about the fact that you did it. No. Jess cried out. He never came to the house. Except for those few times when we had barbecues and invited work friends. We were careful. I wouldn't risk a neighbor seeing his car parked outside. But you weren't careful enough to avoid getting pregnant, I shot back. So you can't blame a broken condom. Cabe strikes me as the type who takes risks and pushes boundaries, as long as he's the one coming out on top. I saw the shock in her eyes when I added, I got tested for STDs last week. I spent 2 or 3 weeks at a time working on the oil rig, then I'd come home for about 2 weeks. Sometimes, I had to cut my time at home short if an issue came up on the job, but the pay was good enough that it never really bothered me, until now. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you didn't give me anything while you were off on business trips, I said, my words sharp as I looked at Jess. She glanced at me, almost timidly. So, your doctor thinks I might have cheated on you, instead of considering that maybe you were unfaithful, she asked, her voice soft but accusatory. My face burned with anger. Even though her doctor's opinion didn't carry much weight with me, it still got under my skin that she was so quick to deflect her own betrayal onto me. I've got a few questions, and I want real answers, I said, trying to keep my temper in check. First, why? Why did you cheat on me? Second, why him? And why would you risk getting pregnant with Cabe? Why didn't you stay on birth control and just pretend you wanted to wait longer to have a baby so you could keep sleeping with him without the risk? I could feel my control slipping, but I kept my voice steady. Eric, no, Jess said, sounding like she was grasping for words. I was lonely. You were gone so much, and I felt frustrated. Cabe was there. We started talking, and before I knew it, we got close. I clenched my fists, trying to stay composed. And as for why you risked getting pregnant? I pressed. I was already involved with Cabe before we stopped using birth control, she admitted. He refuses to use condoms. I tried to reduce the risk by showering afterward. I know it's not the best method, but I thought it was better than nothing. Keeping your legs closed in the first place would have been a better idea, I muttered under my breath. She looked taken aback, but I pushed on. So you cheated on me for 4 months before you got pregnant, and then you kept it going for another 2 months after I said I wanted us to have a baby? I asked, trying to keep the conversation moving forward. Jess nodded. I had a feeling I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop seeing him until I was sure, she admitted. I justified it by thinking that if I was already pregnant, it didn't really matter if I kept sleeping with him. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I heard you telling our moms that Cabe ended things with you. Is that true? I asked, my voice tight. He didn't want to risk you finding out and being on the hook for the child if it turned out to be his, Jess replied. So you two talked about that possibility? I asked, feeling a fresh wave of anger. Jess nodded again. Yes, we did. We both figured you'd never suspect that Connie wasn't yours, and there was a good chance she was Cabe's. But when you got home that first week of July, we were together the whole time. Cabe and I didn't see each other at all while you were home. So, while I was out working to support our family and the life we wanted, you were having an affair with him. Was it because you resented me for being gone, or are you just promiscuous? I asked, almost asking if he was better in bed or if the excitement was more with him, but I held back. It wasn't about that, she said, shaking her head. It was purely physical. I felt a need when you were gone, and Cabe was there. We only got together when you weren't in town. We spent time at his place 3 or 4 nights a week, but I didn't stay over every time. I tried to make it seem like I was mostly at home. We were careful. At work, we never showed any signs of being more than friendly colleagues. I parked in his garage so no one would see my car. And no, she added, almost reading my mind, he's not better endowed, and no, he's not better in bed. We didn't do anything you and I Eric already do. It's just that he was available when you weren't. It was nice. Exciting, even. That's the best way I can describe it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you, Jess said, her voice trembling. I did it for myself. It started because I felt a little lonely. You know how much I value intimacy. Cabe made advances, and honestly, I was flattered. He persuaded me, or maybe I persuaded myself, that it wouldn't hurt anything if you never found out. If I'm only yours when I'm around, then I'm not truly yours, I said, locking eyes with her, trying to keep my voice steady. You were my wife, but you became someone else's lover. You were so careful not to get caught, but then you got pregnant. Did it ever cross your mind what might happen if I found out one day that our first child wasn't mine? Maybe through something as random as a blood type mismatch, or if she didn't resemble any future kids we might have. I paused, bitterness creeping into my tone. Even if you never cheated again, what if you let another man father your next child, or worse, went back to Cabe for another round? Jess shook her head frantically. No. I swore I'd never cheat on you again. I knew that once you bonded with Connie, you'd never walk away from her, even if she wasn't yours biologically. I could already see how committed you were to her. Cabe agrees with you on some points, I said, my voice cold. I'm sure the two of you discussed the possibility of him being the father. You mentioned he called you yesterday to check in, and it's clear the two of you talked about how to keep me in the dark, waiting to see how I'd react. Jess shifted nervously in her chair. And the key word there was, as in I was committed to being Connie's dad, I continued. Both our moms have noticed I haven't even held her once. I haven't changed a single diaper, wrapped her in a blanket, or even given her more than a quick glance from across the room. I'll change that if the DNA test says I'm her father. But for now, let me ask you something, did it ever really matter to you if I was the father, or if it was Cabe? Her response didn't surprise me. Well, of course, I wanted you to be the father, Jess said, her voice soft. But after I found out I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew she'd be beautiful, and I figured you'd never question whether she was yours. If my being away was such a problem, you should have told me a long time ago, I said, frustration building in my chest. All you had to do was ask for more of my time. Everything I did for you. Well, that's definitely going to change, I added, my voice hardening. If Connie's not mine, I'm going back to the rigs, and I'll stay there until I find a woman who wants to be with me, and only me. Not someone who can't keep her vows or stay faithful when I'm not around. Jess's tears flowed freely again. But I need you, she pleaded. I need your help with the baby. We're a family. What about us? We've been doing so well for the last 7 months. I haven't even looked at another man. I've been a devoted wife. We'll figure something out if it turns out I'm the father, I said, my tone cold and final. But until then, I'm not sticking around. I've already packed my things. I paused, letting the words sink in. Carolyn will stay with you for now, and maybe my mom will help too. She's hoping Connie is her granddaughter. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving Jess crying, though not as intensely as before. I nearly ran into Carolyn and my mom, who had clearly been eavesdropping just outside the door. Yeah, I heard everything, Carolyn admitted. But Eric lose hope. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Connie turns out to be your daughter. Seriously? I snapped. You claim you heard everything, but you missed the most important part. Not once did Jess apologize for what she did. There's no remorse. She just kept justifying herself, blaming it on feeling lonely and frustrated, like that makes it okay. And she doesn't even seem to care whether I'm the father or not. She just expects me to clean up the mess and accept it all, I said, my voice laced with frustration. Carolyn looked startled by my intensity, her eyes welling up with tears. My mom tried to defuse the tension. We've moved the car seat and made sure it's secure. I'm going to pack a bag and stay with Sue for a few days. Even if you're not the father, she's been my daughter-in-law for 6 years. I can't Eric her, not yet, at least. But Eric, get me wrong, I Eric approve of what she did either. It makes me just as angry, she said. When they asked where I'd be staying, I told them about my new apartment but kept quiet about the fact that I had already consulted a lawyer and taken steps to protect my share of our assets. I had paid off our credit card debts and secured our investment accounts. The lawyer was preparing divorce papers citing adultery, even though that wouldn't carry much legal weight in our state. I wasn't taking any chances with Jess getting access to our finances online while she was stuck at home. Caution was my priority. I was almost certain that our marriage was beyond repair. The small part of me that had clung to recent moments of happiness had evaporated completely. Trusting her again felt impossible. On my way to the new apartment, I called Dan. I needed someone to talk to, and I figured drinks with him would help. I had originally planned to take a few weeks off work when the baby came, to help Jess adjust, sort of like paternity leave. Now, the thought of being alone in that empty apartment wasn't appealing. Since Dan had some flexibility, he met me at the bar. "So, you talked to Jess, I take it?" he asked once we sat down. I nodded and filled him in on the conversation. "I've consulted the same lawyer you did," Dan said after I finished. Luckily, Cheryl's dad made her sign a prenuptial agreement before we got married. He wanted to protect his business. Cheryl has some shares, but she doesn't get any dividends or hold much power. She'll keep the shares, but I'm entitled to almost everything else. We had talked about this before, and Dan knew Jess would likely get half of our shared assets, which was a considerable amount. We had both contributed financially to the marriage, and with Jess making a decent salary, I planned to create enough disruption to avoid paying alimony. I figured Carolyn might help with that. As for child support, that would only be an issue if Connie turned out to be mine, which I still doubted. "I'm going to get burned for this," I muttered. "I'll suffer even though I didn't do anything wrong." Dan nodded sympathetically. "Mike and I went to visit Eric, and we told him about his wife and Cabe," he said. As expected, Eric lost it. Mike, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I nodded. Eric was mad at us, too. He couldn't believe we were willing to let Cabe walk away after making fools of us. He called us weak for not confronting Cabe the moment we found out. "Mike surprised me, though," Dan continued. "He said, 'Who said we're going to let that idiot off easy? Just Eric do anything rash that'll get you caught. Cabe isn't worth going to jail for.' Eric can be impulsive, but he's not stupid," I said, thinking it over. "He knows that if someone deals with Cabe, they can't get caught." We joked about it a bit, and that seemed to calm him down, Dan added. "But we all know something needs to be heiress about that jerk, it just has to be handled carefully." "Castrating him isn't the right solution," I said, shaking my head. The fact that Cabe called Jess, pretending to check on her and the baby, was really just him making sure I stayed clueless. Dan looked at me, puzzled. "You've got to be kidding me. This guy shouldn't get away with it. Even if he can't father kids anymore, he's still financially responsible, and he's destroyed marriages, yours, mine, and probably Eric's too. Mike might stick with Lana for now because of the kids, but that all depends on how she reacts when he confronts her tonight. He's been holding off for your sake. Well, Cabe's lies are going to catch up with him soon enough. Once these women start talking to each other, he won't be able to hide. His problem is, people Eric realize how hard it is to disappear completely. You can't make the kind of money Cabe wants without being noticed. He's in trouble, no doubt. If we know about 4 women he's cheated with, there have to be more. It's like pulling needles from a haystack, shake it up, and if 4 needles fall out, the whole pile's probably full of them. We need to track down the other husbands who might have been affected, Dan continued. As for punishing him, I don't care how it's heiress, but I'd prefer at least one of his testicles stays intact. Even if he loses both, he could still take hormone supplements and be active. Or maybe we make him unattractive somehow, wrap it in wire to cut off blood flow, or break it with a hammer. He'd still have the urge but wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Plus, that'd mess with his head. Dan laughed, and I knew he'd eventually share this idea with Mike and Eric. I'd already spoken to both of them, and they were on the same page. Maybe Cabe used the same tactic with their wives, dropping the names of other lovers so we could report them to each other, he suggested. Before we left the bar, Dan called Mike and Eric. 2 days later, I went back to the house where Jess and I used to live. Carolyn opened the door, her expression bitter. You didn't waste any time, did you? What's going on? Jess was served divorce papers this morning, I explained. She's been crying non-stop ever since, except when she's with Connie. I can't blame you, but I thought you were going to wait, Carolyn said, her voice softening. She's really upset. Do you think there's any chance for reconciliation if you both go to couples therapy? I shook my head. I'd already made up my mind, and this just confirmed it. I handed her the paternity test results. The baby isn't mine, Carolyn. So unless she's been seeing someone else, Cabe Adams is the father. She'll have to go after him for child support. Carolyn took the envelope, her face crumpling as tears streamed down her cheeks. The reality of her shattered hopes hit her hard. After a final hug, she turned to break the news to Jess. I had already told my mom about the test results. She was heartbroken, knowing she wouldn't be a grandmother. She had stayed home, too angry about Jess's betrayal to stay with Carolyn and Jess. The town was buzzing with rumors about Cabe Adams and his affairs with married women. In the days that followed, when Dan, Mike, Eric, and I confronted our wives, we didn't hold back. We made sure everyone knew who Cabe was and what he'd heiress. None of us were comfortable with the idea of being labeled as cuckolds, but we stood firm, exposing the truth that our wives had fallen for his smooth talk. Cabe's charm had worked its way through several marriages. With Cheryl, all it took was mentioning his past conquests. The other women were lured in by his smooth words and promises. Despite being in seemingly happy marriages, they couldn't resist whatever it was Cabe offered. As soon as the affairs went public, other husbands began demanding paternity tests for the babies born to women linked to Cabe. Later, I found out about 2 more kids. Suspicious husbands started questioning their wives about their behavior, and some couples even ended up in therapy to try to save their marriages. The full scope of Cabe's actions didn't come to light until he revealed it himself to the police. You'd think that with the life he was living, he would have kept his assets in a more liquid form, cash, stocks, bonds, something easy to access in case he needed to run. But instead, he chose to invest in real estate. He owned multiple properties and even filled his house with expensive furniture and artwork, not to mention the usual hunting and fishing gear you'd expect to find around here. His boat was fully decked out for both water skiing and fishing. It's possible the authorities wouldn't have gone after him so quickly, but even if he had tried to sell off everything and disappear, he could have been traced by private investigators. It's hard to vanish entirely when you need a social security number to get any kind of high-paying job that's not cash-based. Cabe didn't seem to grasp just how much danger he was in. He completely underestimated the fury of the husbands. Instead of skipping town, he stuck around, and paid the price for it. Just a few days after word of his affairs spread, he was found lying on the sidewalk near his house during his morning jog. He was in shock and barely conscious. Another runner came across him and called for an ambulance but didn't have anything to cut the straps that had bound Cabe's arms behind his back. When she tried to roll him over, he screamed in pain, and she wisely stopped. When the paramedics arrived, they discovered that, well, his equipment had been crushed. The damage was caused by a 3-pound hammer. I heard this story from Mike while we were at the bar. He shared it with a mix of cheerfulness and seriousness, saying that 2 detectives had told him, if you ever find a 3-pound hammer with some unexplained tissue on it, you'd better get rid of it. Preferably in a swamp. Now, I had nothing to do with that unfortunate event involving that guy's groin, Mike said with a smirk and a wink. But I'm just passing along some friendly advice from the guys at the precinct. Cabe had no idea who had attacked him. He vaguely recalled hearing his doorbell ring either late that night or early in the morning, but he couldn't be sure of the time. It had been dark, and he was half asleep. I think they used a stun gun, Cabe told the investigators. I woke up when they shocked me down there, several times. I remember that much. There might have been 2 of them, but it's all a blur. One of them said something about never messing with another man's wife, and then all I remember was the pain. Unbearable pain. Understandably, Cabe was eager to see whoever did this brought to justice. He gave the police a list of all the women he'd been involved with, married, single, or otherwise. The list turned out to be much longer than anyone expected. With so many potential leads, the investigation got tangled up fast. There were a lot of suspects, but no hard evidence pointed to anyone in particular. And since the exact timing of the attack was uncertain, most alibis were flimsy at best. In private, Mike told me that the investigators felt like Cabe had gotten exactly what he deserved. After a few months, the investigation stalled out, just as we figured it would. As for me, Jess got half of our shared assets in the divorce. The house was sold, and another family moved into the nursery I had painstakingly painted with little animals on the walls. I hoped they appreciated the effort I had put into it. Jess moved back in with her mother, struggling to take care of the baby on her own. At least with Carolyn, she wouldn't be alone. As for her personal life, I couldn't care less. She called me once to apologize, probably after Carolyn confronted her. But she didn't say what exactly she was sorry for, whether it was for cheating, getting pregnant by another man, or the fallout that led to our divorce. I didn't ask. By that point, I had moved on. When she suggested we meet to talk, I turned her down. After that, everything was handled through lawyers, and we never spoke again. I sometimes thought about how much money she'd eventually spend trying to get Cabe to pay child support, knowing he wouldn't do it willingly. She'd get it in the end, but not before hiring lawyers and draining her savings. Cabe was already dealing with several other similar legal battles, and I heard he couldn't even sell his real estate. Between his medical bills, legal fees, and future child support, there wouldn't be much left for his living expenses, assuming he could even hold on to his job. 18 months later, at 3 a.m., I found myself leaning against the lower railing of the oil platform, Econ 626, in the Gulf of Mexico. The cool autumn breeze was refreshing, and my light windbreaker kept me comfortable enough. This was one of my last routine trips to the platforms. I had met someone worth pursuing. We had a great connection, and while I wasn't entirely sure where things would go, I was finally open to the idea of a future again. As I unzipped my jacket, I felt the familiar weight of the lump over my belt. Despite my many attempts to get rid of it, I just couldn't let it go. The risk of holding onto it was irrational, yet somehow, it brought me a strange comfort. Without giving it another thought, I pulled the heavy hammer from its hiding place and tossed it into the sea. Story 2. My wife, Ashley, is 36 and has always been spontaneous and outgoing. I'm the complete opposite. When we met in our 20s, we instantly clicked, and we both realized we brought out the best in each other. She helped me break out of my shell, and I helped her settle down and learn a bit more about responsibility. Throughout our marriage, we've balanced each other out by compromising, communicating, all that. We loved each other deeply, and we always worked hard to keep our marriage smooth. We have 2 kids, a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. Normally, we'd set aside money every month to save up for a family vacation in the summer. Growing up, I never got the chance to visit places like Disneyland, the Grand Canyon, or Niagara Falls, so I wanted to make sure I could take my family to experience those places together. Last summer, I saved up a good amount to take the whole family to Disney for a week, quality family time. But then, our boys heard about this summer camp from one of the neighbor's kids, who had gone every year. It sounded like a blast, and they begged Ashley and me to let them go. After some convincing, we decided it would be best to let them attend the camp, and we sacrificed the Disney trip to make it happen. The camp actually ended up costing less than what I had set aside, so we had a little extra cash to spend. Our dishwasher had broken down beyond repair a few months earlier, so I was excited at the idea of buying a new one. But Ashley still had her sights set on going on vacation. I tried to convince Ashley that getting the dishwasher was the best idea. She kept insisting that she needed something exciting, some kind of escape. In the end, I managed to reason with her, and we bought the new dishwasher. The kids were off at camp for a month, and during the first week, the house was pretty quiet. Ashley and I didn't really talk much. I was swamped with work, and she spent her days volunteering at various places. I started noticing something odd when she began coming home from the community center, where she volunteered, much later than usual. I asked her about it, and she just said Bingo had run late because one of the older guys threw a tantrum over someone cheating. At the time, I didn't think much of it, I trusted her. But it kept happening. One night, while I was home and Ashley was supposedly out volunteering, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw a post from the community center. It said they had to close early because of a burst pipe. The post was from early in the afternoon, so I knew that if Ashley had gone there, she would have had to come back not long after. That's when suspicion hit me hard. I texted her, asking when she planned to come home. She lied, telling me Bingo might run late again. At that point, I knew something was up, and I had to find out what it was. I went to her computer and started looking through her messages on Facebook and Instagram, searching for any clues. There was nothing suspicious there. But when I opened her email, I found something that made my heart sink. She had dozens of emails from Tinder, notifications about new matches and messages from different men. The fact that she was using an app like that knocked the wind out of me. I downloaded Tinder on my phone and used her email to try logging in. We were always open about passwords, so I figured I had a good shot at getting in, and I did. What I saw next completely shocked me. She had been messaging several men, setting up dates, and likely sleeping with them. The dates in the messages lined up with the nights she told me she was staying late at the community center. In some messages, they were even exchanging Snapchat usernames and other details. I took screenshots while I was still logged into her account, then logged out of everything and tried to act like I hadn't seen a thing. If she was going to turn her back on our marriage like that, I wasn't going to give her the chance to explain it away. By the time she got home, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep so I wouldn't have to listen to more lies about where she'd been. After a quick shower, she climbed into bed and did the same, acting like nothing was wrong. But my curiosity got the better of me. While she was asleep, I slipped out of the room with her phone and opened up her Snapchat. As I looked through it, I recorded what I saw on my own phone for evidence. She had been exchanging graphic pictures with these men, pictures of herself. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was when I found a message where she admitted to one of the men that she was married. She told him she was just looking for a little excitement in her life, and he thought it was hot. If excitement was what she wanted, I figured I'd give her some, but probably not in the way she was hoping. I messaged all three of the guys she'd been seeing and sent them my phone number, telling them to text me instead. Ashley had no clue I'd heiressed that, and I'd been secretly texting with these guys for days, getting ready for my confrontation. I asked all three of them to meet me at the community center, acting like I was Ashley and making plans to hook up with them. Ashley had no idea it was bingo night, so I knew the place would be packed, and all of her friends who volunteered with her would be there. I told her to dress up because I was taking her out for a surprise. At first, she was hesitant, but I convinced her it would be fun. She was shocked when I pulled into the community center parking lot, but the real surprise came when we walked inside. All three of the guys she had been cheating on me with were waiting in the lobby. They didn't know each other, so none of them were talking, but when they saw Ashley, their eyes lit up, and they headed her way. The guy who knew about me hung back for a moment, but when I locked eyes with him, he decided to come over too. What followed was a huge confrontation. Ashley spun around and yelled at me for invading her privacy. Two of the guys had no idea she was married, and they told her they never would have crossed that line if they had known. Everyone at the community center was watching the argument unfold. Ashley stormed out and headed home, expecting me to follow so we could keep fighting there. But I had already made arrangements to stay with my brother that night, so I went straight to his place instead. I finally feel ready to talk about it now because the divorce was just finalized last week. Ashley and I have joint custody, but our sons have been wanting to spend more time with me. They're angry at her for tearing our family apart, and even though I'm still upset with her too, I try to encourage them to spend time with her. It's been tough to trust anyone enough to start dating again, but I think I'm ready to give it a try soon, so wish me luck.